Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the military leader of Burkina Faso, is setting himself apart from other African leaders. In a continent where leaders have recklessly taken billions of loans from the IMF and the World Bank, Traoré is one of the few who have had the courage to break this pattern. Recent reports have surfaced online indicating that Traoré has refused financial assistance from the IMF. This is a significant and commendable move that shows Traoré's commitment to safeguarding his country's long-term interests. It is crucial to note that taking loans...
The cologne of multinational boardrooms. I was not trained in Washington nor groomed in Geneva. I speak from the battlefield where my people bleed and the soil remembers. I speak for a nation that has long been treated like a debtor's prison. And today I speak directly to the International Monetary Fund, not with trembling hands, but with a voice rooted in centuries of African pain and now African awakening. For too long, the IMF has posed as a benevolent doctor prescribing economic treatment to sick nations. But what we've learned, what we've suffered...
We're beginning the process of exiting the IMF program with dignity, not as supplicants, but as partners. Our young people are Ghana's greatest assets. We're beginning to see significant growth in sectoral performance. Construction, manufacturing, agriculture, and services are showing very strong growth. This is our moment. This is Ghana's moment to lead. To our fellow Africans across this great continent, Ghana's story is a part of Africa's renaissance. The challenges we face are not unique to us. They are the common inheritance of our shared history and the collective responsibility of our shared future. We in Ghana have proved in 2025 that democracy works, that peaceful transitions of power strengthen us rather than weaken us, and that African solutions to African problems are not just slogans but achievable realities. As Ghana rises, we extend our hands to our neighbors and our partners across Africa. Together, we can and shall build the Africa we want.
IMF, World Bank, all other institutions, they make African countries jump through hoops. Loans will never be able to pay. The US, when they borrow money, they're getting it in 1.5, 1.9 interest rate. Africans, when they get the same amount of money, they're paying 9, 10%. The people who don't need a break, they get a break. The ones who need a break, they don't get a break. The sheer survival of the World Bank, IMF, is based on the fact that African countries and many other developing countries do not succeed. Their success is based on our failure. That has to change. And guess who can make that change? We, the children of Africa.
Across several regions of the continent, a quiet but consequential decision unfolded as multiple African governments stepped back from a proposed $30 billion financing package linked to the International Monetary Fund. The rejection surprised global markets and puzzled observers accustomed to seeing IMF programs as unavoidable lifelines during periods of fiscal stress. Yet within policy circles across Africa, the choice was neither sudden nor emotional. It reflected years of debate, lived experience, and a growing conviction that the traditional model of crisis lending no longer aligns with national priorities or political realities. The offer arrived at a moment of undeniable strain. Rising global interest rates had increased debt servicing costs, commodity prices fluctuated unpredictably, and currencies faced renewed pressure. On paper, the IMF loan promised liquidity, balance of payments support, and reassurance to investors. In practice, it came bundled with conditions that many governments believed would deepen existing vulnerabilities rather than resolve them. The decision to reject the funds was not framed as defiance but as a strategic recalibration of development pathways. For decades, IMF programs followed a familiar pattern across the global south. Emergency financing was tied to structural adjustment measures that prioritized fiscal consolidation, reduced public spending, currency liberalization, and market deregulation. While these reforms were intended to stabilize economies and restore investor confidence, their social impact often proved severe. Across Africa, memories remain vivid of hospitals losing funding, schools deteriorating, public sector wages frozen, and essential subsidies removed almost overnight. In many cases, economic indicators improved while living conditions for ordinary citizens worsened. Those historical experiences continue to shape present decisions. Finance ministries and central banks now operate with a deeper understanding of how austerity measures translate into political instability and long-term developmental setbacks. Cutting fuel or food subsidies may satisfy macroeconomic targets, but it also risks triggering protests, eroding trust in institutions, and pushing millions closer to poverty. Leaders facing youthful populations, high unemployment, and fragile social contracts increasingly see such risks as unacceptable. Another critical factor behind the rejection was the question of policy sovereignty. IMF programs often require close oversight of national budgets, taxation systems, and monetary policy. For governments attempting to assert greater control over their economic agendas, this oversight feels intrusive. The perception that key decisions would effectively be reviewed or influenced by external technocrats has generated resistance among policymakers who argue that domestic challenges require locally tailored solutions rather than standardized prescriptions. Debt sustainability also played a central role. Although the IMF is often viewed as a lender of last resort, its loans add to overall debt stock. Several African countries already carry heavy debt burdens accumulated through a mix of multilateral loans, bilateral agreements, and commercial borrowing, accepting an additional $30 billion package, even at concessional rates, raised fears of prolonging a cycle of dependency rather than breaking it. Policymakers questioned whether refinancing existing obligations with new debt truly constituted relief. Linked to this concern was skepticism about growth outcomes. Critics within African policy communities argue that IMF programs focus heavily on short-term stabilization at the expense of long-term industrialization. Fiscal tightening may reduce deficits, but it can also suppress investment in infrastructure, manufacturing, and human capital. Governments seeking to expand value-added production, diversify exports, and move up global supply chains increasingly view austerity-driven models as incompatible with these goals. The global context has also shifted dramatically. Unlike previous decades, African nations today have more alternatives. Development financing is no longer monopolized by Western-led institutions. Regional development banks, sovereign wealth partnerships, and South-South cooperation offer funding that often comes with fewer policy conditions. While these alternatives are not without risks, they provide governments with leverage and choice. The existence of options fundamentally alters negotiations with institutions like the IMF. Domestic political considerations cannot be overlooked. Across Africa, public awareness of international finance has grown. Civil society organizations, labor unions, and youth movements actively scrutinize loan agreements and demand transparency. In several countries, IMF-linked reforms have become politically toxic, associated with rising living costs and perceived loss of economic dignity. Governments sensitive to public opinion calculate that rejecting such loans may strengthen legitimacy, even if it complicates short-term financing. Currency policy was another point of contention. IMF programs frequently encourage currency devaluation to boost exports and restore competitiveness. While theoretically sound, devaluation often leads to immediate inflation, eroding purchasing power and increasing the cost of imported essentials. In economies heavily dependent on imports for fuel, medicine, and food, this effect can be devastating. Policymakers increasingly question whether repeated devaluations genuinely create sustainable export growth or simply transfer hardship to consumers. There is also growing critique of the one-size-fits-all nature of IMF conditionality. African economies vary widely in structure, resource endowments, and development stages. Applying uniform fiscal targets and reform timelines often ignores these differences. Officials involved in negotiations argued that the proposed $30 billion package failed to adequately account for local realities, including informal economies, climate vulnerabilities, and demographic pressures. Climate considerations played a subtler but significant role. Many African nations are on the front lines of climate change, facing droughts, floods, and unpredictable weather patterns that disrupt agriculture and infrastructure. Governments require fiscal space to invest in adaptation and resilience. IMF-mandated spending cuts could limit the ability to respond to climate shocks, undermining food security and economic stability. Some policymakers questioned why countries contributing least to global emissions should bear the heaviest adjustment costs. Trust, or the lack of it, further influenced the decision. Past IMF engagements often promised growth and stability that failed to materialize for broad segments of society. Even where macroeconomic indicators improved, inequality widened. This history has created a credibility gap. Without clear evidence that new programs would differ fundamentally from past ones, governments hesitated to commit. The rejection also reflected a broader ideological shift. Across Africa, there is renewed emphasis on economic self-determination and regional integration. Continental trade initiatives aim to boost intra-African commerce, reduce dependence on external markets, and create larger domestic value chains. Leaders promoting these agendas view IMF-driven liberalization as potentially undermining regional industrial strategies by exposing nascent industries to premature competition. Another layer of complexity lies in the geopolitical environment. Global power competition has intensified, and financial institutions are increasingly perceived as instruments of influence. Some African policymakers worry that IMF programs could constrain foreign policy autonomy or align countries too closely with particular geopolitical blocs. In a multipolar world, maintaining strategic flexibility has become a priority. It is important to note that rejecting the IMF loan did not imply fiscal recklessness. In many cases, governments pursued alternative measures simultaneously. These included renegotiating existing debts, improving tax collection, cutting wasteful expenditures, and seeking targeted project financing rather than broad budget support. The aim was to stabilize economies without surrendering policy control. Critics of the rejection argue that turning away from IMF support risks market backlash, currency instability, and reduced investor confidence. They warn that alternative financing may come at higher costs or lack transparency. Supporters counter that credibility ultimately derives from sustainable growth and social stability, not merely compliance with external benchmarks. The decision also sparked debate within Africa itself. Economists remain divided on the best path forward. Some emphasize the discipline imposed by IMF programs as necessary for long-term stability. Others argue that development requires tolerance for short-term deficits to finance transformative investments. This debate reflects a maturing policy environment rather than ideological polarization. Internationally, the rejection sent a clear signal. African nations are no longer passive recipients of global economic governance, but active negotiators willing to walk away from deals that do not align with national interests. This posture challenges institutions like the IMF to reconsider their approach, adapt conditionality, and engage more collaboratively with borrowing countries. The implications extend beyond Africa. As more countries assert autonomy in economic decision-making, the architecture of global finance faces pressure to evolve. Flexibility, context-specific reforms, and genuine partnership may become prerequisites for engagement. The era when emergency loans could be imposed with minimal consultation appears to be fading. Ultimately, the rejection of the $30 billion IMF loan was not a single act of defiance but the culmination of long-running reassessments. It reflected lessons learned from decades of adjustment, the availability of new options, and a desire to chart development paths that prioritize social welfare alongside macroeconomic stability. Whether this strategy succeeds will depend on governance, discipline, and the effective use of alternative financing. What is clear is that the decision marks a turning point in how African nations engage with global financial institutions, signaling a shift from dependency toward negotiation and from compliance toward choice. The rejection did not end with a formal announcement or a signal. It unfolded as a process, one that continued to reshape domestic policy debates, regional cooperation, and Africa's broader relationship with the global financial system. What followed the decision to walk away from the $30 billion IMF package was as significant as the rejection itself, because it revealed how deeply economic thinking on the continent has evolved. In the months after the decision, finance ministries across the affected countries moved quickly to reassure domestic markets and international partners. Public statements emphasized fiscal responsibility, transparency, and commitment to macroeconomic stability. Budgets were recalibrated not through sweeping austerity, but through targeted reforms aimed at reducing leakages, improving efficiency, and prioritizing productive sectors, rather than cutting social spending indiscriminately. Governments sought to protect health, education, and food security while trimming wasteful subsidies and non-essential expenditures. Tax reform became a central pillar of the post-IMF strategy. Instead of relying on external borrowing, authorities focused on broadening the tax base and improving collection. Digital tax systems were expanded, customs enforcement strengthened, and loopholes exploited by multinational corporations came under closer scrutiny. While politically sensitive, these reforms were framed as issues of fairness rather than punishment. reinforcing the idea that development must be financed internally as much as possible. At the same time, regional financial cooperation gained momentum. African development institutions increased their coordination, offering balance of payment support, project financing, and currency swap arrangements. These mechanisms did not fully replace IMF resources, but they reduced immediate pressure and demonstrated the viability of regional solutions. For many policymakers, this cooperation was symbolic proof that Africa could pool its own resources to address shared challenges. Trade policy also shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. Governments accelerated efforts to deepen intra-African trade, viewing it as a buffer against external shocks. Reducing reliance on imports from distant markets became both an economic and strategic priority. Investments in logistics, border infrastructure, and payment systems were framed as tools of resilience rather than mere trade facilitation. This internal reorientation was partly inspired by the realization that IMF-style stabilization often assumes continued dependence on external markets, an assumption increasingly questioned by African leaders. The social dimension of the rejection was equally important. In countries that had previously implemented IMF-backed reforms, public reaction to the decision was largely supportive. Civil society organizations praised the move as an assertion of dignity and accountability. Labor unions highlighted the protection of jobs and wages. Small business associations welcomed the avoidance of abrupt currency devaluations and interest rate hikes that would have raised costs overnight. While not universal, this support helped governments weather criticism from international commentators. However, rejecting the IMF loan did not eliminate economic pressure. Inflation remained a concern, currencies faced volatility, and foreign exchange reserves were stretched. The difference lay in how these challenges were addressed. Rather than adopting shock therapy, policymakers favored gradual adjustments, negotiated price controls. On essential goods and strategic import management, these measures were imperfect and sometimes controversial, but they reflected a deliberate choice to prioritize social stability alongside economic correction. International reaction was mixed. Some investors initially responded with caution, interpreting the rejection as a signal of increased risk. Credit rating agencies issued warnings, and bond yields rose in certain cases. Yet over time, the feared collapse did not materialize, as governments demonstrated discipline and coherence in their alternative strategies. Markets adjusted. In some instances, bilateral partners stepped in with targeted support, attracted by clearer development agendas and sector-specific opportunities. The IMF itself was forced into introspection. Quietly, officials acknowledged that resistance to traditional programs was growing not only in Africa but across the global south. Internal discussions began to explore more flexible conditionality, greater emphasis on social protection, and enhanced consultation with borrowing countries. While change was slow, the message from Africa was unmistakable. Engagement would no longer be automatic. A key lesson emerging from the rejection was the importance of policy ownership. Economists within Africa argued that reforms imposed from outside often fail because they lack domestic legitimacy. By contrast, homegrown reforms, even when painful, stand a better chance of success because they are debated, understood, and adapted locally. The post-IMF period became a test case for this argument, offering evidence that economic management rooted in national consensus can be both credible and resilient. Another significant outcome was the redefinition of what support means in times of crisis. Rather than seeking large, all-encompassing rescue packages, governments increasingly favored modular financing, smaller loans tied to specific projects, climate adaptation funds, infrastructure bonds, and diaspora investment instruments. This diversified approach reduced dependence on any single institution and spread risk across multiple channels. The rejection also sharpened conversations about debt justice. Policymakers questioned why African countries, many burdened by debts accumulated under unfavorable terms, were expected to accept strict adjustment measures while historical imbalances remained unaddressed. Calls for debt restructuring, fairer global tax rules, and climate finance gained renewed urgency. The IMF loan rejection, thus, became part of a broader critique of global economic governance. Education and public discourse played a role as well. Media coverage, academic forums, and parliamentary debates unpacked the implications of IMF programs in unprecedented detail. Citizens became more informed about concepts like conditionality, debt sustainability, and fiscal space. This transparency altered the political calculus, making it harder for future governments to enter into opaque agreements without public scrutiny. Over time, the narrative surrounding the rejection evolved. What initially appeared to some as a risky gamble came to be seen as a strategic assertion of choice. The emphasis shifted from what was refused to what was being built in its place. Development plans highlighted industrial policy, agricultural value addition, renewable energy, and digital infrastructure. These priorities contrasted sharply with the narrow stabilization focus often associated with IMF programs. Critically, the rejection did not imply hostility toward international cooperation. African leaders consistently stressed their willingness to engage with global institutions on equal footing. The issue was not the IMF itself, but the terms under which engagement occurred. This distinction mattered, as it signaled openness to reform rather than isolationism. As months turned in 2 years, the broader significance of the decision became clearer. Africa's stance contributed to a global reassessment of crisis financing. Other regions watched closely, drawing lessons about leverage, negotiation, and the power of alternatives. The IMF, facing declining influence in some quarters, was compelled to adapt or risk irrelevance. In conclusion, the rejection of the $30 billion IMF loan was not a rejection of economic discipline, global engagement, or reform. It was a rejection of a model perceived as outdated, socially costly, and misaligned with contemporary development goals. What followed was a complex, ongoing experiment in economic self-determination, marked by both challenges and opportunities. The path chosen was undeniably harder, without the financial cushion of a massive IMF package. Governments faced immediate constraints and tough decisions. Mistakes were made and outcomes varied across countries, yet the willingness to accept responsibility for those choices marked a profound shift in mindset. Ultimately, the decision reflected a deeper transformation in Africa's relationship with global finance. No longer content to be treated as passive recipients of policy prescriptions, African nations asserted their right to negotiate, to choose, and even to refuse. The rejection symbolized a growing confidence that development cannot be imported wholesale, nor dictated from afar, but must be shaped from within. Whether this approach delivers long-term prosperity will depend on governance, accountability, and sustained investment in people and productivity. But regardless of the outcome, the moment itself has already altered the landscape. It signaled that Africa is no longer asking whether it can say no to global financial institutions. It has already done so and, in the process, redefined the terms of engagement for the future.